Hey, Kunik. We know it's a weird time for everybody out there, so we're trying to support you guys with a lot of different perspectives and knowledge. And to that end, we are bringing you a guru of family systems, Mariah Sage. I'll let her introduce herself, and then we've got some amazing questions from all of you that we'll dive into.
Hey everyone, my name's Mariah Sage, as Liz said, and I'm a family systems expert. So I work with families both in home as well as virtually to set up household systems in terms of kind of the day to day routines and rhythms and things like that, but also in terms of systems for communication and breakdowns and kind of all the day to day stressful things that can be a part of parenting to just make your day easier. So I know this is a big topic for everyone right now with everything going on. So I'm really happy to be here.
Definitely. Communications and breakdown, when you said that, I was like, well, that is literally what we're all living through right now. So, on that, I'm going to jump in because that actually made me think of one of the first questions we got, which is how do I share with a spouse? So, if you're in a two-parent household and you're kind of trying to balance both of you being working at home and your kids, what are the best ways to kind of set up sharing responsibilities and duties? And how can you try and avoid any friction? Because the last thing any of us need is more stress.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing right now is just to really sit down and just be honest with each other. So the sooner the better. I think that right now there's so much frenzy going on. Everybody's under an extra amount of stress, and it's really easy to fall into just kind of like coping mode. Like you're just doing the best you can, getting through day by day. But if you can schedule even just 20 minutes to sit down with your partner and just say, okay, what are the little things we can do to support each other? Like, do you need 20 minutes in the morning to yourself? Do I need it, in the afternoon? And just make a couple of agreements with each other and then try it for a week and revisit. So don't overwhelm yourself with like a million systems you have to do, but agree on like what are those top two or three things you can do to be supportive of each other during this time, whether that's working as shifts or whether that's making sure that you take turns so that each person gets a little time for self-care, but just committing to like probably two things at a time and then trying it for a few days and see how it goes.
I like that trying it because I think that's one of the things that's tough right now is nobody knows how long all of this is going to last. So to try and think about doing duration is hard. So I like that idea of like try it for a few days, readjust, try it for a few days, readjust. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime you put a new system in place, every family's different. That's what it comes down to. So there are things I can tell you that work for a lot of people, but I can't know your work situation or the age of your children or all those details. And so you kind of have to put your minds together and just, yeah, give it a trial period and see what happens and be willing. Like right now, I mean, I encourage this for families anyway, but a weekly family meeting where you sit down, even if your kids aren't old enough, just the two parents together, sit down and check in and say, hey, what worked this week and what didn't work, and how can we adjust in the week going forward? I think right now more than ever, that kind of communication is really valuable.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that is it's a weird thing because a lot of us aren't used to working in the same space with our spouse all the time. And so it makes sense. You might think, oh, we're together all the time, so we don't need to be doing those kind of things. But I guess that leaves a lot of room for miscommunication, for resentment, for all sorts of different things to happen, for passive aggressive behavior, whatever it is. But it makes sense. Even though you're physically together more, you need to keep up the communication part of it.
Yeah, possibly more than ever, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, that brings me into another one that we got a question on, which is structure and routine. So most of us are used to having kind of some norms, some structures. We get to the office at an hour, we leave at an hour. We're all home right now. How can we try and put some normalcy, some routine, and some structure around a really strange time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now the biggest thing I see is that we have to find a balance between structure and flexibility. So I do encourage people to sit down and say, okay, what routines can we commit to keeping? So, for example, if your kids wake up for a certain time for school most of the time, maybe you don't want to get your kids up at 6:30 if that's when they normally have to get up, right? But maybe you get them out of bed by 8 every morning and make sure they still stay in their regular morning routine and keep things as normal as possible for them, because that way you're not going to throw off bedtime and meal times and all of
Mm.
those other things. So the thing about structure and routine is that each and every system is dependent on the other one, right? They all work together. And so, so looking at like, what are those foundational times in your day? So mornings and bedtime are probably the most important. So as normal as you can keep that stuff, I really encourage people to just stick with, the closest you possibly can to what your kids are used to. But then within that, it's also be willing to adjust and be flexible, right? Just like we talked a little bit about with, communication with your partner and going week by week right now and just seeing what's going to work. The same thing goes with your routine. So you might have to course correct as you go because this is a really unpredictable time. But I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and even families who homeschool their kids and who are used to this kind of level of complexity. And the fact is, it just requires even more systems because you don't have those outside structures that you are used to having, like school and pickups and drop-offs and all those things. And so you have to create that within your home and within your family. So like I said, I kind of think of it as these like benchmarks during the day. So mornings and bedtimes are huge. But then also like in the afternoon, maybe even if your kids are older and they don't take a nap, you could schedule quiet time in their room. So that could be like 30 minutes to an hour where they go in their room and you set them up with some books or a couple of toys and you kind of dim the lights and just give them a little time on their own and, leave the door open if that feels better. But kind of set up a couple of times during the day that you commit to and then know that not everything is going to go to plan every single day and that's okay, right? But if you can have those few moments that like these are the things we can count on, that goes a really long way and it kind of keeps a rhythm going so that things don't kind of go into chaos.
Yeah, makes total sense. Set some lampposts of normalcy along that path.
Yeah.
I get that. So to that end, assuming that we can get kids into quiet time or nap time, what can parents do? Because for a lot of us, that's going to be our best working time, right? When we can really drill down. So how do you recommend that we really try and take the best advantage of those productive nap times?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, of course, that's definitely the time when you're going to be able to get the most work done, right? And at the same time, I think it's important to remember that if you're not taken care of, you're not going to be productive. So a lot of the time, what I tell parents, if they are working from home with a young child, because again, I work with a lot of entrepreneurial families, and so this is a really common topic, is like if your kid naps for an hour, take the first 10 minutes and do something for yourself. Like even if it's really small, 10 minutes every single day for the week is going to go a long way, right? So if that's like a 10-minute stretch, or if it's like a walk around the block, if you have a partner who's home and can be present, or, whatever it is, sitting in the backyard and doing some breathing or anything that's going to give you a minute to just care for yourself, then you're going to be more productive, right? Because otherwise you might be scattered or exhausted. And then you're like, okay, this is my chance, right, to get things done. But then you sit down and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't even focus, right? So I think those little pockets of self-care go a long way. And then on top of that, it would just be prioritizing. So, in the evening, maybe before you go to bed, one of my personal favorite practices is that I sit down with my to-dos and my calendar for the next day. And I just pick like, what are my 2 priorities tomorrow? Like if I don't get anything else done, if everything, if my day doesn't go as planned, what are the 2 things that I absolutely am committed to getting done tomorrow and focusing on? And so maybe save those for nap time.
That's really cool. I make a ton of to-do lists, but I've never heard that tip of prioritizing the outside because realistically, none of us ever get through our whole to-do list. That never happens, even in the best circumstances. I love that. I'm gonna start doing that. I've never heard. I make lists every night, but I never heard that.
Perfect. Great.
Cool. All right, moving on. Okay, interesting. So, kind of related, but not nap time. What can we do? What are activities we can do? We've had actually this question from people with different aged kids. So we had one with a 1.5-year-old, 1.5-year-old asking, how can I encourage self play? How can I, what activities can I do with somebody who needs a lot of attention at 1.5? And we've also had people with tweens, 9, 10, 11, saying, how can I get these kids some release, some energy release and keep them busy because they've got a whole different energy level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, there's a lot there in that question. So,
Yeah, break it up however you want.
the first thing I'll say is that I think a big question for people right now is screen time because it's a really easy
Yeah.
fallback. in a time
Yeah.
like this. And normally I advocate for limiting screen time as much as you're able. And I think right now that this is a time when it's okay to let up a little bit on that. And I think that, when it comes to the guilt around it, just give yourself a break. It's okay. Like you have a lot on your plate. And, if your kids watch an extra hour of TV for a few weeks, it's not the end of the world. So I think that's just important for people to keep in mind, is that it's not a huge deal, right? And that said, I really encourage structure around that. So if you know that you're going to need to give them more screen time, don't just say, okay, you can watch another movie, or whatever, and kind of let it go unstructured. I would choose, like, this is how much is okay right now, right? So if that means it's 2 hours a day right now, 3 hours a day, that's what it is, right? But don't put no structure around it, basically, because then you're setting yourself up for tantrums and meltdowns and things like that. So that's
Hmm.
one piece. And then aside from that, so when it comes to independent play, there's a system that I teach parents that really is relevant at every single age. And it basically comes down to, and I mentioned I have kind of a sheet that breaks this down that I can share maybe in the comments later.
That'd be great.
Uh,
We'd love that.
yeah, but basically what it comes down to is the fact that if you have ever had the experience of developing the ability to spend time alone with yourself, like that can be something that's uncomfortable for adults, right? Like if you're somebody who's extroverted, especially, it can be really hard to be alone with yourself, right? It can be uncomfortable, and at first you don't really know what to do. But then a lot of the time, what happens is if you start really focusing on that as a practice, is you start to really love it, and you start to learn, like, oh, I love to journal, or I love to take walks, or whatever else it is you find in that time. And so the same thing actually goes for children. So when children are used to being constantly stimulated, it's uncomfortable for them to be left alone, right? They don't know what to do with themselves at first. And so there can be some pushback there. But the most important thing is that it's okay for them to have that, because independent play is actually really great for children's development of their imagination and their personalities, and has so many benefits. And so the way to do it is basically in increments. So start with 10 minutes. So even if your child is 1.5, put them in a little area that's safe, maybe a little playpen for 10 minutes, set a timer. If they fuss, come over and say, hey, you're doing a great job. Right now it's time for you to play by yourself. I'm over here working. I'll be back. And kind of keep checking in with them. And then each day you can increase that time a little more and a little more. And so with older kids, a lot of the time what happens is that they'll tell you they're bored, or they don't want to do it, or they don't like it, or they'll whine and things like that. And so rather than resisting them, you just say, oh, I know this is hard. I know you're bored, but if you're bored, you can just sit in your room and do nothing. It's just 20 minutes. That's okay. And I'll be back in 20 minutes, And then when you come in 20 minutes, if they're like, that was terrible, and, I didn't do anything, be like, oh man, I'm sorry, but you did so great. You stayed in your room. And then what happens is over time, they find their play, and they find their ability to entertain themselves, and they start to develop that comfort level in that space. So it's a
Huh.
process. So that's not like, it's not going to happen overnight, but a week from now, your child could be playing for half an hour alone if you really work on that every single day consistently.
Okay, you're definitely gonna have to post that sheet, and I think you'll have a lot of people wanting to learn more, because that's huge. Quick question on that: can you start with a kid less than 1.5, or no?
You can. The piece that's difficult there is obviously that they don't have the communication.
Communication. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that said, you can do a lot non-verbally, right? And I mean, you still talk to them, of course, but like I've done this with little kids. I mean, I used to nanny a little girl. I was with her from the time she was born, actually, and by the time she was 1, she would play by herself for like 30 minutes at a time, like perfectly happy. And so it's the same thing. You just go back and check in. If they start fussing, you don't just ignore them. You can let them fuss for like 30 seconds or something, and then go over and kind of soothe them a little bit, and then walk away again, and just kind of work on that, like, okay, I'm across the room, but I'm here, but we're doing our own thing. So it's kind of a process of just getting them comfortable with it.
Amazing. So one word that you used earlier that I think strikes a nerve for a lot of us is guilt. And
Mhm.
that's something that is a constant for working parents, of course. But right now, when we're sharing space together, when we're already stressed, when we're already exhausted, there's going to be a lot of guilt around not giving the kids everything they need, guilt around not getting enough time with them, guilt around working in front of them, being on phones and computers in front of them because we're working at odd hours and in odd ways. How can we try and deal with that?
Well, there's a couple parts of that. So, the practical side of that to me is that a great remedy for this is what I just call quality time. So, that means that in the middle of your day, maybe you're having to work long stretches and you have your kids home with you. But the thing about kids, and especially young kids, is that a little bit of time can go a long way. But in that time, it's all about your presence. And so, if you can even find a 10-minute pocket to sit down and play with your child, but you make it like a mindfulness practice of when you're sitting down with your child, you put work out of your mind for that 10 minutes and you give them your full presence and attention, they feel the difference in that, right? So it's not that
Mm,
they need your attention all day, but it's like when you do have a minute, like really practice being present with them. And especially I think with all the stress and kind of hysteria going on, it's like, discipline yourself too, to like put that out of your mind and enjoy that time with your child. So that's one piece of it. And then in terms of like the emotional piece for yourself, I think it's just about really being honest with yourself and not resisting that emotion. So when you feel the guilt
mm,
come up, not writing it off and saying, oh, well, this is what I have to do. And so, whatever, but rather just like acknowledging it and saying like, okay, I'm feeling guilty right now. Like, what's the root of this, and just kind of letting yourself feel it for a minute, but then going back to, okay, well, I'm doing my best. And, here are the things I am doing and focusing on the positives and just kind of those regular, like emotional coping skills.
yeah, absolutely. I love that, because the other thing when you said mindfulness and with the kids, I think it's something they can also be such a good release for us right now when
Mm.
we're, inundated with news, inundated with a lot of crisis happening in the world, to just have 10 minutes focused not on news, not on work, not on anything adult, and just focus with kids could potentially be super healthy for us too, not just them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. They're such like little balls of light. So it's great to do that for us too, right? That's their
Absolutely.
Mhm.
This has been incredibly helpful. Before we sign off, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would want to, put out there for us to think about?
I think the only other thing to me is just that, in this kind of crazy time, that it's just really important that we protect our emotional lives with our families, right? And that we don't let the fear take over. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with presence and just that,
Mm,
it's important to stay informed. It's important to take care of ourselves right now and be really safe and cautious and aware. And at the same time, same thing, be aware about things like having the news on in the house when your kids are around, be aware about how much you're taking in yourself and really focus on, I was just speaking with a client actually, and she was like a little stressed about having both her kids home this week. Luckily, she has the time to spend with them. And I said, hey, why don't you make this a time of like family bonding, like just see it like that. Like we have all this time, like what projects can we do together? How can we have fun together, and just, yeah, just kind of using it in the most, positive way we possibly can given the situation.
absolutely. Amazing advice. Thank you so much, Mariah. Stay
You,
safe, wash your hands. We'll talk with you again very soon.
you. All
Bye.
right, you, bye.